coming out today. My name is Rick Mestis. I'm the city manager for Raton, and I would first like to thank the Wild West History Association for putting this event together. Thank you so much. As the story goes, the Lincoln County War was a conflict between rival factions which began in 1878 in Lincoln County, New Mexico territory. The debate still rages today as who are the good guys and who are the bad. The conflict began between two factions competing for profits from dry goods and cattle interests in the county. It was marked by revenge killing, climaxing in the Battle of Lincoln, a 5-day gunfight between the sheriff's office and the regulators, a rival deputized posse, including Billy the Kid. The story ends nearly 144 years ago after Pat Garrett was named Lincoln County Sheriff and he hunted down Billy the Kid, killing 2 other former regulators in the process at Fort Sumner in July of 1881. During the Lincoln County War, 23 were killed and 23 were wounded. Fast forward to a few years ago, an extensive research reveals that Garrett and fellow lawman Frank Stewart together led the posse. The research on the case and the capture of Billy the Kid indicates that, like today, credit goes to the person who is able to gather the better press, and that person becomes the legend. But we're here to honor the person that is really unknown in this story until now. The research revealed that Frank Stewart was an alias for a German immigrant named John Wallace Green. Stewart would later be a railroad detective, a deputy sheriff, and a ranch foreman. He died in 1983. He died at the age of 83 on May 11th, 1935, and was buried here in Raton without a marker. Today we recognize the lawman John Wallace Green, also known as Frank Stewart. I'd like to turn it over to Kurt. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. That was great. We needed that background. Well, thank you to not only Rick, but also John Davovich. Where are you, John? Oh, well, I tell you, we couldn't have done it without him. He's wonderful. And Mike, too. Yeah, let's give him a hand. He worked and worked. Melanie Aldretti of the Raton Library, of course, who organized the book signing, which we'll have later today at 1 o'clock. That session is where we will answer questions, and if you don't get a book here, you can get it down there. 1 o'clock at the Johnson Library. I also want to thank the Wild West History Association, which, by the way, has their name on the back of this tombstone. We're all members of that group. Our president is here, Paul Marquez, came down from Denver, so you'll meet him after a while. Thank you, the rest of you, for coming. You know, I have fond memories of Raton. In my younger days, I knew a delightful young lady from Raton. I won't reveal her identity, but I was hoping she'd be out there today or listen to our radio broadcast this morning or something. But the mystery woman, I hope you hear this. That was 1968, 56 years ago. Is that right? Yeah, something like that. So anyway, if you go back another 40 years, right before 1968, you get to 1928, and at that time, John Green was walking the streets of Raton right here. So it's not that long ago that these things were going on. This event is long awaited. When I first came here in 2022, after we discovered where Frank Stewart, I'm going to call him Frank Stewart for a while, Roy will reveal the mystery. We came in 2022. Consequently, that's why the tombstone has 2023 on the back of it. But that was during COVID, and unfortunately, they had a hard time getting tombstones, they told us. So, anyway, Frank Stewart is finally getting recognition for his service 144 years ago to the citizens of New Mexico and Raton. He spent most of his life as a lawman, so he served the public, you, us. Why are we here? We're here to dedicate the grave of what appears to be two men, but it's actually only one man. When Roy and I first started, we knew him as Frank Stewart because his initials were inscribed on an old Colt revolver that I had collected. I'm in the Western antique business, and I got this wonderful old pistol and beautiful Victorian monogram on the pearl grip said FS. And so Roy and I were doing other work, and I said, Roy, we got to find out who FS is. And with that gun came an old typescript affidavit that said something like this. I'll just paraphrase it. And it was punched out with an old typewriter, you could tell. In 1934, it said, "The history of the old gun the way I remember it. It belonged to a Texas lawman who captured Billy the Kid." Someone wrote the Colt factory and found out that it actually was a brace of pistols presented to someone. The other pistol is owned by a Santa Fe Railroad conductor and cannot be had for any price. That was in 1934. So that sparked our journey and resulted in this book, which you're seeing today. 4.5 years of our lives we put into this book. So we don't invent any conversations. None of the things you read in our book is fiction. It's all 100% guaranteed. We back up everything we say. 700 and something footnotes. We don't say Billy the Kid said, "How are you, Pat?" or anything like that, because we weren't there, okay? That's what some books do. It turns out that Frank Stewart was born in Germany in 1852, October the 23rd, and at age 6, his family arrived in the United States. His mother died shortly after their arrival, evidently, and he and his father went west, the same thing that Billy the Kid's family did. And they even ended up in the same place, Kansas. Of course, Billy the Kid's family eventually came on down to New Mexico, but anyway, I will tell you what happened after that. He and his father worked on a ranch in Kansas, and then his father died, as some people think, killed by Indians, and then Frank worked on a ranch in the panhandle of Texas. He first appeared in New Mexico in this county, Colfax County, in 1871. He was searching for two criminals, one of which has a great name that Roy and I really like, called Coal Oil Jimmy. I can't remember the other guy's name. Can you remember the other guy's? Taylor. Oh, yeah. Taylor the Barber. So he had already turned kind of a bounty hunter by that time, and I'm sure he came over here to get the reward. So he, sure enough, kills Coal Oil Jimmy, and you can read about the details in our book. But after that, he became leader of the alias Ranch Cowboys, which is in the panhandle of Texas, and he met up with a Pinkerton detective named Charlie Siringo. Have you heard of Charlie Siringo? I hope. He's written several books. We don't much care for him because he always put himself above everybody else and claimed to be places he wasn't, and he downplayed the role of Frank Stewart. So we don't think much of his writing. But Frank Stewart was hired by the Canadian River Cattlemen's Association. This was about 1879. And that group was started by Charles Goodnight and a bunch of Texas Panhandle ranchers, and they formed the Panhandle. Well, first it was the Canadian River Cattlemen's Association, later became the Panhandle Plains Cattlemen's Association. Charles Goodnight and several other prominent cattlemen in the Texas Panhandle, and they wanted Frank to assemble a posse and come to New Mexico and rid the country, extending all the way from the Chisholm country in eastern New Mexico that extended all the way up into Texas. It was the same group. Usually they say they stole stock in New Mexico and sold them in Texas. Then when they got in Texas, they'd steal stock and drive it back to New Mexico. So that's back when you could do that and get away with it. They didn't deadhead. They made it count both ways. Well, the dramatic part came when Frank Stewart united with Pat Garrett, who by that time had been commissioned to also rid the country of rustlers. And one of the gangs that was identified was the one that was led by Billy the Kid. So they focused on Billy the Kid, both Frank Stewart and Pat Garrett. And after chasing Billy the Kid for several months from Las Vegas area on down there, even approaching this area, on the cold wintry night of December the 23rd, 1880, the combined posse trapped 5 members of the gang in a sheep herder's cabin, a little small house at Stinking Spring, which is about 20 miles east of the present town of Fort Sumner. It's just a few miles from the little town of Tyban, if you know where that is. When Frank Stewart assembled his posse, he said the greatest thing, I love this, those were tough times. They got mad at Frank Stewart, the posse members, and but Frank said this, and I love this. He said, a bunch of them didn't go, and he said, I want no man who hesitates. I just love that. Because this was dangerous work, okay? You're going to get killed, probably, maybe. So he didn't want anybody that was, not committed. So on that cold wintry night, try to visualize this. It was exceptionally cold, and they had tracked them from Fort Sumner, 5 of them to start with, to Stinking Spring. By the way, it's just one spring there, not 2, like you read in all the books. They can't resist saying Stinking Springs. I guess Springs sounds better. I don't know, but anyway, it's one spring. Ojo hediendo, if you speak Spanish. Pat Garrett wanted to rush the house. They surrounded this little bitty rock house, and Frank Stewart wisely counseled, no, let's don't do that. Somebody will get killed for sure. Let's wait until daylight so we can see what we're doing. So they surrounded the little rock house. And I mean, if you ever go there, it is tiny. And picture 5 guys huddled in there and with 2 horses. By the way, they took 2 of their horses in there to keep them out of the weather. They tethered, or it might have been vice versa, 3 and 2 outside. So when Frank Stewart and his men and Pat Garrett arrived at the rock house, there were the horses. They knew they were in there. But what they do, they had to lie out there in the snow all night long, waiting for daylight. Now, can you imagine that? I mean, that's what lawmen used to do in New Mexico and Texas, and when the West was really wild. Garrett instructed his men that Billy was the man that was wearing a sombrero with a green hat band. Some people say green sombrero. Maybe it was a green sombrero. Anyway, he told his men, if you see a guy with a sombrero that has a green hat band, start shooting. So they're all huddled around the place, and sure enough, here daylight at dawn approaches. Out comes a guy wearing a sombrero with a green hat band. Well, they just all open up on him with 86 Winchesters and big, powerful guns. I mean, the story is he was hit 7 times, the guy in the green sombrero, but guess what? It wasn't Billy. Pat Garrett told him that the guy wearing that hat would be Billy, but it turned out that Charlie Beaudry put his hat on and walked out, and they killed Charlie Beaudry. So they pulled him back in. If you've ever seen the movies Young Guns, they've got a kind of a Hollywood version of this, but it's still useful. It'll give you the idea of what happened. So Charlie staggers back in the house. Billy pulls him in, and he said, Charlie, you're going to die anyway. Go out there and guns blazing, take some with you. So he did, and he staggered out, and of course he's dying, and he is famous for saying these last words. He said, I wish, I wish, I wish, and fell at the ground at Pat Garrett's feet. I think I know what he was wishing for. He was wishing he hadn't put on that hat. Anyway, Billy the Kid, Dave Rudabaugh, Billy Wilson, and Tom Pickett were in the house, and they would not surrender. Pat Garrett started talking to them, trying to talk them into surrendering, and picture yourself in that house. Those men inside felt every bad human emotion you can feel. They were cold, they were tired, they were hungry, they were scared, and in modern language, they were depressed. They just didn't know what was going to happen to them. Meanwhile, the fireside posse outside, the lawmen started cooking breakfast. And the outlaws could smell the coffee and the bacon cooking and, eggs and everything. So it wasn't long before they couldn't resist. The story goes that Dave Rudabaugh stuck out a little handkerchief that used to be white, and so they surrendered. Frank Stewart, Garrett, and the deputies loaded them into a wagon and took them first to Las Vegas, and then they took them to by train to Santa Fe. They went to Las Vegas because that was the closest place they would get on a train, and it was dangerous trying to haul four bad guys, through the countryside. The citizens of Las Vegas showered them with gifts, Frank Stewart and Pat Garrett both. They gave them gold coins. They presented these two fabulous fancy pistols. Oh, they just gave them all kinds of stuff because they were so glad to be rid of these rustlers. So they get on to Santa Fe to collect the reward, and acting Governor Axtell wouldn't pay them the reward. I can't imagine this, but this is the way it happened. And he told them to go back to Lincoln because that's where the crime was committed that Billy was convicted of. And keep this in mind, of all the murders in the Lincoln County War, like Rick mentioned, Billy the Kid was the only one ever convicted. So, just think about that. People ask us all the time, do we think Billy's a bad guy, outlaw, or a good guy? Well, you make up your own mind, but he was the only one convicted. Well, you know the rest of the story. Billy was jailed in the Lincoln County Courthouse. He escapes, and in the process, he kills two deputies, Bob Bollinger and James Bell. And in the ensuing weeks and months, he roams the hills between Lincoln and Fort Sumner until finally he's so lonely he returns to Fort Sumner to see his sweetheart, Paulita Maxwell, daughter of Pete Maxwell, who owned the old army post. On the night of July the 14th, 1881, Billy is hungry again. He walks across the plaza at Fort Sumner to cut a piece of beef off a side of beef that was hanging on Pete Maxwell's porch. He had a butcher knife in one hand. Some authors say he had a Colt Lightning in the other hand. Maybe did, maybe not. He approaches the house. He sees two guys in the dark, and he says, Key and S, Key and S. Well, they'd never seen Billy the Kid before, and they didn't know his voice, so they didn't say anything. It was John Poe and Kip McKinney. And so they just sat there frozen. Meanwhile, Billy backs into the Maxwell house, a doorway, gets to Pete Maxwell's bedroom, and he senses some, in the dark, he senses somebody on the bed beside Pete Maxwell. Well, Garrett turns to Pete Maxwell, and Pete Maxwell said, alias, that means that's him. So Garrett was sitting on his gun belt, and so he's trying to get his gun belt turned around. You don't read this much in the books, but he jerked out his gun and fired twice. We're almost through anyway. So the first shot hit Billy in the heart, and he died right there. There's no doubt about it. Over 100 people identified Billy's body when they buried him. So don't believe any of these stories about some imposter, prankster, claiming he was Billy the Kid later. So what happened to Frank Stewart after the death of Billy the Kid? Well, in 1885, he was a foreman of various ranches around Las Vegas, and by 1903, he had married Molly Crabtree in Oklahoma, and they had 7 sons. Wonderful picture in our book of that. By 1910, he was recorded in the census as living right here in Raton. In 1920, he moved to Amarillo and became a watchman, and he disappeared from history after that. I mean, just Frank Green vanished like a ghost, like so many Old West characters did. But fortunately, with this ghost, we know what happened. So this story has a happy ending. I'm going to stop now and let my colleague, esteemed co-author Roy Young, tell you the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. Thank you.
I won't belabor this too long because I know it's starting to get warm, but we want to answer the question, why is Frank Stewart, John Green buried here? When I was speaking with Laura Brewer, your Ratonian editor, she said, why did you choose Raton? And so I explained the story of how Frank and his family spent a total of 19 years here. He was here as early as 1871 when he was a bounty hunter. And if you have not studied the story of Coal Oil Jimmy, just Google it. It's quite a story of the character he was and Taylor the barber and the atrocities that they committed. And Frank and Jim McIntyre became bounty hunters and traced them down and pretended to join the gang. Well, that night, Coal Oil Jimmy and the barber are sleeping, and Frank Stewart kills Coal Oil Jimmy, and Jim McIntyre kills the barber, brings them into Cimarron. They're laid out on storeroom doors in front of Henry Lambert's mercantile, and a picture was made that has never been found. If you ever see a picture of the dead bodies of Coal Oil Jimmy and the barber, we're desperately trying to find that. The newspaper said that the photographer took several photos. So that's the beginning of Frank Stewart in Raton and Colfax County. And then he's in and out of here. As he said, in 1910, he's in the census record living in Raton. But after a period of time, he went back to Amarillo looking for work. He had become poor. His family was virtually destitute. In fact, there's a notice in the Amarillo newspaper, if anyone has work for this man, please contact the newspaper because they have no money. They're living in a little apartment in an alley. And somehow word got out that he was involved in the capture of Billy the Kid. And here comes a newspaper columnist, I'll say, to interview Frank, who they only knew then as John Green. He had dropped using the alias. But someone said, hey, John Green is Frank Stewart. So they interviewed him, and for the first time since 1881, he admitted to being Frank Stewart and being in the posse. And as Kurt and I began to dig into the story, he wasn't just in the posse, but he was the co-leader of the posse. And most of the time in the Las Vegas Optic and the Las Vegas Gazette, it mentions Frank Stewart first and Pat Garrett second. But because Pat Garrett wrote the biography the next year and barely mentioned Frank Stewart, he fell into oblivion. And of course, Pat killing Billy the Kid, Frank was further pushed into the background. So here we are in the 1930s, and he's being interviewed, and he admits and tells his story. He gets a few little details confused, but he basically has the gist of the story of what happened. But again, he doesn't try to grab the glory. So many old-timers are self-aggrandizing glory hunters and want to put themselves right in the center, like Charlie Siringo and Pat Garrett, and minimize what anyone else does. So that article and a picture appears in the Amarillo newspaper, and from then on, people began to recognize, hey, this old boy is someone we want to know. Within 3 years, he had returned to Raton and lived in what is called the Fairview community. Is that familiar to some of you folks? The Fairview community. And he worked at Flower Mound, not Flower Mound, that's in Oklahoma, Wagon Mound. And he was also involved with the railroad, because after his service in capturing Billy the Kid, he became a railroad detective and a deputy sheriff in the county in which Santa Fe sits. So we had no idea when he died, where he died, how he died, because the early Raton newspapers are not online like 10 million other newspapers. And I still can't figure out why the Raton newspapers have not been put online, because every other newspaper practically in America is. So we had someone search the Raton newspaper and found his obituary. And we were thrilled at that, because it told us that he had died May 11th, 1935 at the age of 83. And I'll read you his obituary. John W. Green passed away at his home in Fairview Addition, Raton, on Saturday night. He was 83 years of age and had been a resident of this county for 19 years, working in the AT and SF shops until a few years ago. The deceased is survived by his wife and 6 sons. I was able to trace out one granddaughter, and we worked together, and she provided a number of photographs of Frank Stewart and his family. And then she either died or went to a nursing home or something, and I lost touch with her. And we know there's a lot of descendants out there, because John Green, Frank Stewart, and his wife had 7 sons. But we have not been able to contact a single one except that one granddaughter who either died or something else happened. So, knowing he was buried here, we came and met with John Dobovich back here. He's a hero, folks. And he worked with the president, and they agreed that we could put a marker here. We think he's buried right in this area, but we can't pinpoint exactly his grave. And we want to thank the Fairmont Cemetery Association for kindly giving us this prominent spot. And boy, is it prominent. John tells me every time a car comes by, they stop and read this tombstone, because he killed Billy the Kid. He captured Billy the Kid. We thought Pat Garrett did. But our book is fully documented. As he said, over 700 footnotes. We're weeding out the myth and the legend and getting to the truth of the story based on contemporary records, such as newspapers and testimonies and memories of those who were there. So that's how Frank came to be buried here, and for us to honor him today. The Wild West History Association, of which I am a member, and Kurt and Paul is going to come here in a few minutes. He's our president. We have another board member, Tim Hageman, in the audience. We want to tell you a little bit of why the Wild West History Association wanted to put this marker here in Raton. So I'll call on Paul Marquez, president of the Wild West History Association, to come and tell you a little bit more.
Thank you, Roy. Hello, my name is Paul Marquez, born and raised in Denver. Newly elected president of the Wild West History Association. If you don't know what Wild West History Association is, you're about to find out. These beautiful journals are full of factual, scholarly stories of the Old West. The photos, the stories, the footnotes are chock full of information when you're looking for outlaws and lawmen of the Old West, the characters of the Old West, and the shenanigans that were going on in the Wild West. Well, Wild West History Association has over 500 members today, worldwide. We have people in Germany, Australia, and people, when we have a roundup each year in a different city, different state, it's called a roundup. We have speakers, presenters. We take tours on these roundups. But most of all, these journals is what is our showcase. Well, Wild West History Association came to me years ago by Mark Lee Gardner. I met him in Denver. He had mentioned to me that once he heard a story of mine about Billy the Kid and my family, who was associated with Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett. Well, Mark Lee Gardner introduced me to folks at the Wild West History Association and said that you should belong to this group. So I joined, and I couldn't be happier. We have so many great members here. I would like to introduce Bob Pulsifer, sitting in the front row from Denver. Ed Bathke from Roxborough, West Denver area. Tim Hageman from Mora, New Mexico. Roy Young from Apache, Oklahoma. And Kurt House from Three Rivers, Texas. And Charlotte Young, Roy's beautiful wife, and most of all, my beautiful wife, Catherine Marquez. Thank you. I wanted to talk just a little bit about this book. By picking up this big, heavy book, you want a book in your lap. This fills your lap. It's full of pictures. The pictures, some of these pictures had not been published before. The story of Pat Garrett and Frank Stewart and posse chasing Billy the Kid all the way through the snow, late December 1880, is a story that won't be forgotten. With Frank Stewart coming into Las Vegas, New Mexico with Pat Garrett on the buckboard and the outlaws, the townsfolk were eager to see who these outlaws were. They wanted to know. They wanted pictures of them. They wanted the story. And the story is that Pat Garrett had to back a lot of these townsfolk off the buckboard. The townsfolk wanted Dave Rudabaugh. Dave Rudabaugh was said to kill a jailer in New Mexico, in Las Vegas, New Mexico. So a lot of these townsfolk, the Hispanos in Las Vegas, New Mexico, wanted Dave Rudabaugh. They wanted to see him on the end of a rope. Well, Pat Garrett was smart enough to hold these prisoners in that buckboard and tell the townsfolk, I'll arm these gentlemen if you rush this wagon. Well, they stayed the night. They boarded a train the next morning, and they headed to New Mexico, and there's the rest of the story that Roy had mentioned and Kurt. I wanted to thank you all for being here today. Please look us up when you get a chance, wildwesthistoryassociation.org. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to call forward Marla Martin, the 2010 Texas State Poet Laureate.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's actually Carla. Carla with a K. That's okay. I've been called many things. Well, thanks so much. As Texas Poet Laureate and with my fellow Texas Poet Laureate Alan Berkelback, we traveled the country doing a national parks tour. We went to all 63 national parks, wrote a big book about it. And on the way, we found ourselves along the Santa Fe Trail over and over and over again. And because of this Wild West Association's contribution and Kurt and Roy's contribution with this marker, it's like, wow, Raton is taking its proper place in the history of things, in the history of the Wild West. So you are bringing such an honor to our town. And when Alan and I wrote in our next project is the Santa Fe Trail. But these are areas also that Billy the Kid, that Frank Stewart, they all rode over and over again. And we just wrote just a really quick, tiny little poem. The two of us did. I can't take all the credit. But this is a very short version of it. And, you know, Roy and Kirk deal in the facts, and that was great. And as a poet, it's like, oh, the feelings behind it. And there are many people, as I'm sure you've come across, that say, oh, Billy he really wasn't a bad guy. He was you know, circumstances. And so as a poet, you get to deal a little bit with emotions instead of fact. But this is just a quick little poem, and it's called The Lament of Frank Stewart. Because even though he was a good guy and he's a hero, you often wonder what do they go through when they're having to address people, and it's like, okay, was he really good or was he really bad? The Lament of Frank Stewart. The ghost of Frank Stewart is restless. He sleeps on a hill in Raton. Still he wrestles with that age-old question. Was Billy the Kid's death right or wrong? He'll ask you, where are my pistols? Those colts had a silvery shine. What's in a name or a story? The governor left him to die. Some folks say I rode with Pat Garrett, or I didn't ride with him at all. Let's all say a prayer for Billy, no matter what truth we recall. Regret's a tough burr in the saddle. It lingers even though I am gone. Should I have cuffed that forsaken boy? Was Billy the Kid's death right or wrong? Thank you so much. Thank you, Rick.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. Sometimes they have left out the T and I've been Carla Moron, so it's okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our ceremony. Thank you so much for turning out, and have a great, wonderful day.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Don't forget the library, 1 o'clock. We'll be there to answer questions, sell the books, and give you more details should you want them on any of those subjects. Thank you for coming.